everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, doctoral student in psychology. And with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. In this life, no man is an island unto himself. In fact, humanity is not an island unto itself. No matter how individualistic or independent we may be, the fact is our lives rely heavily on many other entities, human and otherwise. Within this construct, we become members of innumerable groups, from families to companies to countries. Whether it's belonging to the human race or being a partner in a marriage, there's no denying we feel the need to just belong. Okay, so this one, it wasn't really a listener request, but a friend of mine posted on Facebook that he feels that to him, happiness is feeling a sense of belonging, right?
Yep.
And I immediately had a negative reaction to this. I said, well, I don't believe that because, if I can enjoy a sunset by myself and that's happiness, right? I don't need anybody to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, being philosophical, you start to trace it back and all of a sudden you get back to, well, technically, if I didn't belong to anything, there would be no humans and I wouldn't be here to enjoy a sunset. So maybe belonging is necessary in order to have happiness,
I've got 5 different thoughts already, so I'm going to follow your pattern, man, because it's complicated.
Yeah. A lot of my internal thoughts go the same way our conversations do. It starts out very simple, and then the more you start picking apart, you realize that it's impossibly complex.
Yeah.
Which is part of the charm and frustration with our show, right? Some people love it and some people hate it. Just, you never get anywhere. You never answer anything. Well, I guess the question is, are there answers?
Are there answers? And we have fun poking at them, trying to find some. So, look, if Forky can do it, so can we.
Yeah. So I guess let's start out with what is it? What is belonging?
The etymology of the word is really it surprised me. I hadn't looked into that, and it's Old English. That part's not surprising. It's 14th century ish, but the notion that it arises of pertaining to being associated with, related to, or property of. So belonging has a kind of troubling proprietarian strand in its original iteration, but the idea of going along with is interesting, and I think that's relevant. That
kind of foreshadows some of our future discussion on it, because there's really kind of a couple ways to think about belonging, right? There's and this isn't, I don't think this is a technical term in the discussion of it, but the way I would put it is there's an ascribed element to belonging and there's an attributional element to belonging, right? If you're picking up on what I'm saying, can you sort of outline the two of them, or would you like me to?
I want you to start with that. I think I'm picking up on where you are, but I like the ascribed, and the second one was attributive.
Yeah,
and I think there's also a third one, and that would be aspirational. But
yeah, okay, yeah, and I think that's a good place to start. So in my crackpot philosophy here, this is the way I'd put it, right? So ascribed, right? That's something that you're kind of born with. You're born belonging to certain groups, right? Mm-hmm. You're born with a family. You don't get to choose your family. You're born with them. You're born with any of the physical attributes that make you up. You're born as a human or an animal or any of these other things, right? So the things that you're born with, that's kind of your ascribed groups that you belong to. Attributional belonging is groups that you belong to based off of the actions or choices that you make throughout life, right? So you choose your friends. kind of. Your friends sort of choose you too. There's a back and forth there. But
there is.
The groups, if I decide that I want to join, the Rotary Club or something, right? Then I'm choosing to do that. That's part of, an attributional belonging. I have certain attributes. I'm following a certain thing. Now, aspirational, that'd be a little bit different, right? Because that's a group that you want to belong to, but there is a threshold or a guardian that you have to conform to certain ways in order to belong to.
A codification of some kind that you must accept in order to be part of it.
Right.
And so, I like where you're going with this. I think that's because ascriptional, the ascribed, you don't get to choose. However, let's say you're born, and the early part of your life, you're not terribly physically fit. There is an aspirational part of that can change. There's also the attributive part that can change. So it's not like you're born, you're always going to look like you look. Absolutely. So they blend.
Yeah, that's a really good example because there's an interaction between all three there, right? You could be born with certain genetic attributes. Maybe you're small boned or you're big boned, right? And then you have attributional, or you have the aspirational part where you want to be in shape, or you want to be something or another. Then you have the attributional part, which is how you put in the effort in order to get to where your goals want to be. So it's almost there's an interplay between all three of them.
You're making me think about this. I was walking. Well, I walk with my granddaughter every day. We go visit places, but she's getting more used to what's on Main Street. I'll be talking about what this building is, what that building is. Well, where we live, there's a place called the Moose Club. Has a big picture of a moose on the top, and she's very young, and so she said, "Only mooses go in," and I don't see moose, and have to be moose, and so that whole thing is bound up there. Can you be in the Moose Club if you're not a moose? And what does it take to be a moose? What's the code? Because I told her, well, it's not really moose. It's just they chose that picture.
It's a perfectly rational thing to think.
Yeah,
if you look at it.
Yeah.
And so we defined these three categories.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is, coming back to the main topic, right? We're talking about belonging. So how we interact with these groups. So I guess an interesting question would be, going back to my initial objection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can belonging occur in isolation?
Aristotle would have said no, but who cares what Aristotle says? There's another old white guy, but still, there's some contribution to the world of thought. To be a thing in the world, for Aristotle, to be in the world, to be something in the world, you have to belong to a particular species, and this is what you were just talking about. You act toward an end of some kind, and then he associated with work. So you're a manager, you work at a factory, so you have to form material into organized wholes. You are involved in making something, in other words, and to do that, you're probably going to be in some way or other associated with other people. So belonging in that sense, to actualize, I'm using Maslow's terms, but it's okay to jump to Maslow, because Maslow has the hierarchy, right? The psychological, and just below self-actualization is belonging. It's like the fourth level up, I think, if my memory is right, but it's way up there.
Yeah. And so coming back to the original individual that made this post, right? What he said wouldn't be objected to by Maslow at all. Maslow would look at that as being sort of a prerequisite to getting to that higher level of being human, And so I think that, where it gets complicated is now that we've defined these three categories, which is just us,
it's just us.
To the best of my knowledge, I don't think anybody else has defined them, but I think that they're relatively accurate. Like I said in the intro, humanity isn't even an island, right? We're part of the world. So we belong to the human race. But that's not enough to be self-sufficient, So we depend on these other things. So in some ways, belonging can't occur in isolation. And that probably comes down to a lot of the ascribed belonging.
Yeah.
The things that you are born with, you necessarily belong to in conjunction with other people. When it comes to attributional or aspirational belonging, do you think that that's something you can do without interaction from other people? Or do you think that there's always going to be some sort of sociological element to it?
I think there's a sociological element to it, but because of this question, I went back and was doing some reading, because we always do when questions come up, and thinking back through Sartre and more recent things, many people now are talking about the first element of belonging is to belong to yourself. And in order to belong to yourself, there's a lot of work to do to figure out just who it is that you are and how you are becoming. There's some essays one can find where it's you're essentially, I think it's David White. You're searching. If you're searching for yourself, what you're really doing is saying, well, I'm not this. I'm not this. I did this today, but that's really not me. And the act of disassociating yourself from some of your acts is a long path around saying, I'm trying to find my way home. And there are poets and philosophers who say the only home that there really is whatever is inside of you.
Right. So that's necessarily a philosophical endeavor.
Yes. And it's necessary part of then how are you going to belong to something else if you're not even sure who you are? Otherwise, you're just willy-nilly, oh, well, I like what they do, so I'll believe what they're believing for a while. There's the authentic part of it, I think, for any one of us, is to try to figure out where we belong with a particular association, whether it's a unit of any kind of family or whatever. Where do we reject parts of our family? Some of us, we reject parts of what we don't whole cloth say, they're my family and so they're perfect and so everything that they say goes. I don't think any one of us who ever rebelled would accept that. And this morning before the show, when we were talking about just because somebody takes a label, if we let that label simply define them in all ways, we are not only doing them a disservice, we're doing our own mentality a disservice, because we know pretty well that human beings are much more complicated and paradoxical and oxymoronic than that. So belonging doesn't necessarily mean being owned by, absolutely, or swallowing the Kool-Aid for any particular group. As you're probing what they stand for, and you know, well, I stand for this, but I don't stand for that. So I'll call myself this, but I'm not that. I think this is what happens with religions. It's what happens with Catholicism in various countries, Christianity of various sects and varieties, organizations like the Moose or whatever it happens to be. What's the difference between a moose and a Kiwanis?
Right? Yeah.
All right. Well, you'd have to. That would be a good question, right?
Yeah.
You have to look at their codes. What does it mean to be a Mandalorian? This is the way. Well, which Mandalorian group? Because apparently, jumping into the fiction, there's more than one code. Yeah,
and it's funny. We were talking about it before the show. I was in a meeting with some of the higher ups in a webinar talking about silicone rubber manufacturing, right? And another guy that works for me, he was involved with glass making for a long time, and he said, to to this day, I walk past a skyscraper and I can tell if one window's shinier than the other, they put the coating on the wrong side. They put the window on the wrong side. Or if you see a window that has wavy lines, it means that, it was laminated wrong and this sort of stuff, right? So things that you take for granted, and even things at a very basic or simplistic level, are highly diverse, and some of us may laugh at it, thinking about like a maverick or rebellious element of the Kiwanis Club, right? But these things have serious consequences. Even in, my hometown here, looking at the library, right? Something that you don't think of as being very controversial. There's large amounts of taxpayer money. There's, ads. There's groups that are against each other. There's all these things, right? Yeah. So it doesn't really matter what the group is. There's going to be people that belong. There's going to be people that don't belong. And there's going to be people within that group that have different ideations about what the group should be and what's going on.
And that's what Sartre was talking about. So I'll go back to existentialism because I still think it's viable. And he says the individual understood as belonging to a certain social situation, but not totally determined by that social situation. But that requires of the individual going beyond what they're given, the code, whatever it is, and saying, nope, it's more complicated than that. I object, I revise, I rebel, I push back. And then you've got the organization saying, hey, you don't believe what we believe, you're out. Or you aren't the boss of me, so I'm going to tell you this organization is going to change, and.
Yeah, and we're seeing that happen in the Republican political party right now, right?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
So, a few years ago, you had the Tea Party movement, and they were looked at as like a sort of splinter offshoot of the Republican Party. And then Donald Trump became president, right? And you had this sort of shocking power shift, and you saw people starting to conform opinions or there was argument, there was debate, there was all this stuff. But we've reached a point now where there's becoming a slow solidification behind the more extreme beliefs there. And, there might be a party split, but I think that when you look at the power dynamics in the American political system, I think it's more likely that people will just fall in line behind the more extreme position. And so, regardless of what your views are on the Republican Party, it is a fascinating case study in
it's a process,
right? And how something, and especially you look at what the things stood for. A big one that just popped up this week was Ted Cruz mocking the military, right?
Yeah.
Saying that there's an emasculated military.
Yeah.
And the Republicans have traditionally been the party of military support, unquestioning military support. Mm-hmm. So you see a shift like that, and you realize, how beliefs and rhetoric and these sorts of things, how they can evolve relatively quickly, right? This has been pretty much less than a decade.
They evolve relatively quickly, but they also cloak. So in Cruz's case, what it says cloaking is actually it's saying, you got to have. Essentially, he's saying you got to have big tough guys being in the army, and if you're a trans person or you're a woman or you can't be a big tough guy. I mean, he's cloaking in that case. So there's a seeming evolution, but there's also a cloaking of the underlying agenda, which goes back to a stereotype. So it's not a moving forward uniformly. I think there's and that's what these guys are doing. Kurt Vonnegut. You and I were talking about him this morning. He was saying that the trouble in our society, we in a marriage, you expect your partner to be everything in the world to you, and that's just not generally viable. Your family, unless you have a large family, that's not necessarily viable. He's saying, you got to have at least 50 or more people if you're going to. And so he says, I recommend that everybody here, this was the commencement address, join all sorts of organizations, no matter how ridiculous, simply to get more people in his or her life. It doesn't matter much if all the other members are morons. Quantities of relatives of any sort are what we need. to bounce off of. And so
Yeah, and we've talked about a little bit about that in the past. Like I've always lived in the one town, and I really didn't have any meaningful interactions with people of other races until I joined the Army, right? And on the whole, I don't. I regard that as sort of a wash, right? I had some really good experiences. I met some really good people, and there's some things about it that I didn't care for. But the fact is that being in there and meeting all kinds of different people definitely broadened my horizons, broadened my thinking, gave me some different perspective on things, and that's really important. But yeah, thinking about, and so groups can change just like individuals can change, right?
Yes,
so
exactly.
I mean, you see
that's where you were going with that.
Yeah, you see that development within the Republican Party. Yeah. And one thing that about that situation that really gave me a giggle was the language used. Ted Cruz used the word emasculated.
Yes.
And it got me thinking back to the election. And when you look at the term emasculated, to be made weaker, to be less effective in a situation, I think about what Donald Trump did to Ted Cruz,
my gosh.
And then how, the fall in line, I think, well, that to me is a much more appropriate use of the word emasculate.
I would say so. Again, just take the case by itself. Most of us, unless we utterly hated our fathers, there's something primal about someone insulting one's father or mother, for that matter, right? And so to go through a whole raft of excoriations about one's father, his attitude, his inabilities, and so on and so forth, and then to say, yeah, you're right, Dad was like that because I really like you. That's essentially how I see somebody like Cruz.
Right.
And I do not, I just find it vile.
Yeah.
In the sense of, you don't have to worship your father or anybody else in your family. I don't think that that's healthy. You've defied over your life. Well, most of us find ourselves in very different places, politically, socially, whatever. But there's still a primal element that says, unless it's been an abusive relationship, unless it's been just an ugly, violent, awful thing, and unfortunately people experience that. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about standard father stuff. I do not see how one could accept all of that and say, oh, yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. Ted Cruz to me is one of the most repulsive people on the planet, and I'm a political independent. I voted.
Yes, you are.
I voted conservative. I voted liberal. I voted independent. I've gone all different ways. I look at things by a case issue, and
this is a case by case issue.
And I mean, you see some of it happen on both sides. I mean, you look at Biden-Harris's election and the way that they spoke in debates about each other, and and you think, well, some of that same falling in line, or is it some of people changing opinions, or, how you want to look at things. But the fact of the matter is, when in certain cases you look at it and you think this is just doesn't seem.
And we're talking
right.
about a belonging. So right now we're implying the club of fathers and sons. Or the club of children and fathers, let's say. All right. And so we're implying that there's a code in there, or suggesting a code, not all written out, nicely detailed and subscripted and so on, but it's superscripted, but we're suggesting that it's there. And he's not in the club. So we're saying he doesn't belong in this sacrosanct club somehow. I just want to, pulling it to what we're talking about, we seem to just constantly determine whether something belongs or whether it doesn't.
Right. So that'll kind of lead us into the next question, right? Which is, you talked about it in the etymology, and now we're sort of addressing it here. Is there always an element of ownership to belonging, do you think?
I think so. And that may go to that proprietarian thing back in the 14th century, that not ownership as in the ownership of people, which that may to some extent have been about. But I guess we'll use the capitalistic, we're saying owning anyway, buying into, making a transactional, I'm willing to give my time to you because I believe in what your codes say. I think that the trouble is that, to keep with the capitalistic, most of us probably don't know exactly what we're getting into, let's say in a workplace. I spent 33 years in one place, and what that place was and what it became and how it changed because of leadership and social pressures and everything else. It wasn't a static thing. Constant rewriting of mission statements, going from a sentence to 3 pages, and all. But I think that oddly, like all of these agreements we make, we've talked about before, when you want to use an app, and you got to, do we really read through all the pages and pages before we press the button because I want to play the game, or press the button because I want the service? I think an awful lot of us probably do not look chapter and verse at the codified beliefs or statements of an organization.
Yeah. And you and I talked that one of the questions I asked you about that was, do you think that it's still valid or binding even though people don't read it? And you said yes. And I would agree with that, right? Because somebody has the option, right? You have the option to read through the whole agreement and understand exactly what you're getting into. But we choose not to because of how we value our time, or, what we believe the consequences to be. Belonging is very similar, right? Of course, the ascribed to belonging, we don't have a choice in, but the aspirational and the attributional, we do have a say in. But lots of times we don't give it much thought, right? If you decide, lots of times you don't even decide if you're going to become friends with somebody. And I've talked about this in the past. This is one of my favorite lines. Introverts don't make friends. They're just adopted by extroverts. And that's me, right? I'm an introvert. I've never made friends with anybody. There's just these extroverts that come along, and I'll be standing by myself in a social situation, and they'll say, "Hey, what's up? Hey, what do you do? Wow, you're really interesting. Hey, you want to hang out sometime?" That's the way it's always gone. That's my wife asked me out on our first date. I've never engaged with somebody. I've never been the proactive member, right? I'm going
to challenge that. I have to challenge that because it's fun. You were my student. We enjoyed the interaction. There was a time when we were really out of each other's lives. You reached out to me with this marvelous opportunity, which has taken a lot of your energy to engineer and put together out of joy, interest, friendship. We weren't friends when you were one of my students. We have become so. That's a shifting and a changing, but this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't proactively done that. I didn't come to you and say, "Hey, Joel, would you be able to do this?" You did that. So I have to challenge that you.
Yeah, I guess that it would be sort of, well, I watch American Pickers sometimes, which is a show where these guys go around buying junk from people. Yep. Well, when they buy the first piece of junk, they call it breaking the ice. Like, as soon as you buy that first thing, then you have the relationships flowing, going. So I guess that's kind of the way I look at it, right? So when we first started in class, it was a safe space where there could be a two-way dialogue. And to me, that was breaking the ice. So at that point, then I knew, okay, now I know this guy. Did I really? How much did I actually know you at that point? Not a whole lot, but I knew enough that there was some potential there to develop a relationship, right? But I still, if let's say I heard you I overheard you having a philosophical conversation in a coffee shop or something, right? Even if I liked what you were saying, I don't think I'd go out of my way to say,
okay, all right. Fair enough. Challenge and counter challenge.
So, yeah. So, I probably am overgeneralizing. I'm sure that if I really thought about it, there'd be times where I did, step in and form a relationship somehow. But
this is what thinking about belonging means.
Yeah.
I I've told you this many times, so it's an old story, but I'll keep it really brief. But it's about belonging. I've gone back to this in my head. In my extreme youth, I finally did the salvational, soul-saving thing with the Wesleyan Church, because primarily most of my friends were already saved. I'm doing the air quotes. And there was a lot of peer pressure, but there was also, maybe I'll get to know people better. But it was mostly peer pressure. I went through this an intensive experience of an afternoon. I know now what they were trying to do, but I was welcomed into this church group by the people I'd been singing in the choir for a few years. I was a teenager. And everybody said to me, "Hi, and they introduced themselves as if they're, well, welcome. We're glad to have you." It's like, what is this? Mm. And so that experience lasted for about a day and a half. The trouble is that I kept maintaining it. Even I would try to batter myself into believing that I believed, but ultimately no. And then a different flash forward, a different pastor who had been a Buddhist, and then he was a Wesleyan pastor. He wore a robe. He smoked a pipe. He had this amazing class for teenagers. He was questioning everything. His wife was the next nun. And so I joined the church. But then when I went to college, and the next pastor came along and sent the codification of the church, what they were thinking about whether or not they were going to change some things. Here's all the rules, and which I'd never seen before. And I wrote back this long letter, single space, typed on both sides, because I was a college student. I was just full of myself and what I was learning, and challenging the ideas about women being subservient and this kind of thing. And I received a letter back a week or two later that said, "Well, clearly your views don't hold with ours anymore. We've removed you from the membership rolls." Now, that's not how that's supposed to happen, but that's what was done. That sudden unbelonging was a freedom, but it also was a catalyst to me minoring in philosophy and religions. It started way back then because you threw me out because I was asking questions and challenging something you wanted us to talk about in the first place. How dare you? And had that not happened, I might not have had the joyous intellectual, spiritual explorations of decades that I've had. So I suppose I have to thank Pastor Dick, which is what he called himself. That's his name, not mine. But I don't, because it was the wrong thing to have done. So I don't belong. And yet I was going to a church for a long time because I was supportive of what the pastor was trying to do, but I couldn't accept the tenets of the church.
Yeah. So that covers everything we've been talking about, right? It talks about how organizations continue to evolve over time, how people belong to organizations and how they conform and things. And it talks about, the most recent thing we were talking about, which is the ownership, right? And the kind of thought that we put into these things, which is usually not very much. Even people like you and I, who consider ourselves, in some ways to be thinkers. We talked about it last week, didn't we? When you were talking about hitting your head on the window.
That's right.
And stuff. It doesn't matter how smart you are. The human
still do stupid things.
Yeah, the human brain is hardwired in such a way as to try to take the path of least resistance. It's trying to automate as much as it can for you, so you don't have to be agonizingly trying to make decisions over the littlest things.
Right.
And in many ways, that's very beneficial to being a human. But in some ways it's not, right? So you are sort of hardwired to want to put in the least amount of thought in order to get where you need to go. And when it comes to belonging, we don't think about it much, Okay, well, I belong to this friend group, or even a job, right? Okay, well, this monetary number, which money is just sort of an invented concept anyways, this monetary number is going to decide where I decide to spend over a third of my life with people. You know, I spend more time with these people than my wife or my family. All different kind of stuff. The work that you do, the things that you contribute to the world, all of this very important stuff. Lots of times can boil down to, oh, well, this is my geographical location and this is the highest bidder, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And you know, your anecdote there about the church also, you know, what, like you said, you didn't fully know what the church believed until you were provided a codified sort of thing. And then all of a sudden that made you realize, oh, I don't agree with some of this, you know?
Yeah.
But, you know, when it comes to belonging, sometimes we don't consider a lot of this stuff. I think that there's the emotional element. Like my friend said, the guy who initiated this whole concept, this thought pattern in me, you know, to me, happiness is feeling that I belong. Well, that's true, right?
Yeah.
Feeling that you belong sometimes is enough to override that thought of, well, what are the beliefs of the organization? What are my beliefs? How is this affecting me and the world around me and these sorts of things? Sometimes just that shot of dopamine is enough to say, oh, well, this is where I'm going to stay, or, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So that can be kind of dangerous, can't it?
Well, it can be if it becomes a very passive thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even in a family unit. And again, there's so many people that I encountered in my work and my friend life over decades that had horrific family experiences. You know, and so I'm not trying to speak in one term for everybody about this, but I think that the commonality is that in one way or another, we have the opportunity, the agency, and perhaps even the responsibility to ourselves to think, to what degree do I go along with this unit just because they spawned me?
Yeah, exactly.
I've been trained into the respect, and they've earned the respect, and so on, but not in all things. They certainly don't agree with me about everything, and I certainly can't agree with them about everything. And some are now gone. My mom passed, and so on. My dad's old, and he's about as viable as an old man, and therefore I challenge him to keep. Why are you thinking this? You know, there's that dynamic of a relationship that sometimes leads to humorous exchanges, that sometimes leads to silences, sometimes leads to complete changes of subjects because it's clear we're not going to be able to go there. But that itself makes you say, what's so wrong that we can't even talk about this? That's much more active. And I'm not saying, well, look at me being superior. No, I've written way too much on things that about my family. So I'm not offering it as a superior thing. I'm just saying that when we engage with thinking about the things that we're not really supposed to think about, family, religion, whatever, politics, then we really can find a dynamic rekindling of what we think belonging means.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I'm thinking back to what you were saying earlier in the show when I was asking if belonging can occur in isolation. You know, when we were talking about the attributional or the aspirational and how, you know, a huge part of belonging does occur just with your interaction with yourself. And we've talked about relationships in the past and if you can have a relationship with yourself and this sort of thing. But that's super important, right? Because,
yes, it is.
You know, if you don't engage in belonging with yourself, then your belonging with every other entity is going to be a passive relationship. You do have to, on some level, think about, well, what does it mean to be me? And this raises a whole bunch of other philosophical questions we've talked about in the past regarding meaning and identity and knowledge and all this other stuff. But yeah, what does it mean to be me? How do I belong? Who do I want to, what things do I want to belong to? Ownership. What things do I want to own? You know, what things do I want to belong to me?
And we keep changing. And therefore our belonging to ourselves, as well as to those immediately around us, is constantly in flux, whether it's because of how we change a house space, the space in which we live, any number of things. I think we can't assert that we are on the path to authenticity I don't think you ever completely achieve authenticity any more than you completely achieve self-realization, actualization, as Maslow would have said. Yeah, moments. All of those are nice moments, but it all collapses again. But we're not authentic if we're not trying to figure ourselves out.
Yeah. And I think that authenticity or the actualization isn't possible for the reason that when we talked about authenticity, I compared it to an engine, right? There's constant motion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so authenticity isn't developing a static thing, but it's rather developing a running thing, something that has motion, that moves and works well together. But when it comes to belonging, it's very similar, right? Because you can't ever be authentic or you can never be authentic or actualized because you can't belong in isolation. So being part of the human race, which is, concatenate to being part of the world, well, all that stuff is always in flux. It's always changing. Yes. Other people are changing. The environment's changing. Our knowledge is changing. All this stuff is changing. So you can never be authentic because you can't figure yourself out because you are codependent on everything else, and everything else is changing. Right?
Yes, exactly. You said that so well. I keep thinking because of my father, because of the mechanistic metaphor. He's a mechanic. How many of us can't even figure out exactly what the problem is in a car engine sometimes? And that's a limited device with a finite number of pieces. We have an infinite number of pieces in ourselves from our experiences, from the way our brains are firing, the number of neurons we have, on and on and on. If we can't even all the time figure out easily what's going on in a vehicle, how could we think that we know ourselves so well that snap, this is who we are, this is who we're always going to be, and therefore I belong to this because that's just how that always is. No.
Yeah, I mean, even if I was the most reflective, actualized, authentic person in the world, all it takes is some aspect that makes up who I am changing to throw that in upheaval, right? Let's say I ask you next week, hey, Norm, you want a podcast? And you say, I'm not really interested in philosophy anymore, and I don't want a podcast ever again, right? That would sort of,
that might please some people, but
yeah, some people would love that. But that would change fundamentally who I am, right? Because then all of a sudden I'd have to think, wow, this guy that I've looked up to and that we've had all these good conversations with, suddenly he decided that this thing we've put a lot of time into is no longer worth doing, And I'm sure that after thinking through it, I would still come to a similar... I'd land in a similar spot. I'd think, well, you know what? I still think stuff is worth thinking about, and I'm going to move on, but it would fundamentally change my perspective in some way.
It would.
The same way any new experience does, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. Is any new experience, right? Whether you're getting a new job or whether you're having a family conflict or whatever it is, changes your perspective. So this idea of authenticity, this idea of becoming who you are, it's not a real concept because you don't have static attributes that you're trying to attain. What you're doing is constantly reevaluating your current positions in light of the context you're in order to determine what kind of groups you want to belong to and what sort of attributes you want to belong to.
Yes, that's really well said. And then we can use a local metaphor for the people who might be listening who are local. Let's think of Letchworth Park and going down all the marvelous paths and trails. One would be foolishly hard pressed. One would be foolish being hard pressed to say that trail on any given week is exactly the same trail. There may be a shale slide. There may have been a little bit of a mudslide. This may have given way. You have to take a little detour around a spot that happened. Even though that trail has been laid in like all the ruts in our brains, there's still change.
Yeah.
And if we're not sensitive to that, then we go falling off or break an ankle or something.
So what do you think some of the moral implications of belonging are? Specifically talking about I guess, misrepresentation or conformity.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the pitfalls of belonging?
What you just said, misrepresentation and conformity. If I utterly conform to everything that the family unit wants, or the organization, the workplace, whatever unit it is, I may be trying to be fiercely loyal and accepting everything. But if I accept everything that I'm not thinking about, as we said this before, so I think the pitfall is in conformity is that if it removes one's impetus to rethink.
Yeah, this is really interesting, right? Because it can happen on both sides. So if you're the organization, you can misrepresent yourself and then require conformity. And if you're the individual, you can misrepresent yourself and conform. And the best sort of illustration of that would be like job interviews, right? Or something. But something you and I were talking about before the show really makes this conversation interesting, which was that there was an article that came out this week saying that women who don't perceive gender inequality report higher subjective happiness, right?
Yeah.
So the objective fact of the matter is that there is gender inequality. Women get paid less, women get treated worse.
Yeah.
But women who don't perceive that, who say that doesn't exist, are happier, right? So when it comes to this idea of belonging, which what we were just talking about, if you just conform to whatever group you're in, you just become a cog in a machine. Is it that bad or good, right? So it's bad, right? From an intellectual perspective, from a philosophical perspective. You're not putting any thought into what you're doing. You could become a cog in a machine that has very deleterious consequences on the environment or society. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, if it comes back to a value system, right? So if you value philosophy or intellectual pursuits, it's bad. But if what you value is happiness, just pure happiness, right? Or a feeling of comfortability or these sorts of things.
Yes.
Right?
Not the same thing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So if those are your primary values or objectives, then maybe that self-reflection or that idea of belonging isn't bad. Do you think you could make that argument?
I think people make that argument all the time. Welcome to philosophy. We make you miserable. That's what Socrates was saying all the time. Look, you don't call yourself a gadfly, or other people call you that because you say, "Oh, I'm nice to be around." Darn it! Here comes that fly again. But happiness and comfortableness or comfortability are not the same things in value, I think, for those of us who are flies. And so, of course, what's one of the most ancient axioms about what you don't know won't hurt you, or how many different tropes are there about don't get knowledge because it just makes you miserable. I think that's what that case is that you've pointed out.
Yeah, so moral hedonism probably wouldn't espouse a intellectual examination of belonging, because they wouldn't see any value in it to the human experience. I mean, if you're thinking about it that way, existentially, what the human experience is, I guess if you're valuing an individual emotional state versus a collective human sort of viewpoint, that really kind of determines whether there is even a moral conundrum with conformity and misrepresentation and belonging, which is really fascinating, right? You'd think that conformity and misrepresentation would just be explicitly wrong if looked at philosophically, but it's really not.
And that's where the self-justificatory activities happen with any a political party or organizations which themselves change. They change their rules. Some group, authority, we've talked about authority members, decided that you can't have tattoos that show. We find this puts off customers. Well, how did you find that? What determined that? Or is this just a group of people saying moralistically, no, we don't like tattoos, and so you're not going to have them? What does that tattoo ostensibly do to somehow challenge somebody? Why would it even be a thing? And so a seemingly simple rule change underscores the necessity of rethinking and rethinking and rethinking. Don't want to belong with this anymore. Well, maybe I do because I like the paycheck, but I don't like this, and I'm going to say something about it. Well, you don't have a right to say about it. You've signed on. Well, actually, you still do have a right to say some things about it as a human being.
Yeah, and that happened while I was in the Army. I saw it swing in both directions where, when I joined, you couldn't get in even if you had allergies because we were in a drawdown. And then when I was in, they drew down even further. And so they started making requirements tighter and tighter. And they came to the point where they said, hey, if you have any tattoos that can be seen in summer PTs, which are short sleeves and shorts, you can't get promoted.
Really?
Right. And you had high-ranking sergeants who had done 2 tours in Iraq, who had tattoos that were espousing their pride in the military. I'm just thinking how many
Navy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And it didn't last very long. It didn't last very long. They did. But then you have it on the other end of the spectrum too, where we ran into some guys who had stories. It was before my time, but they had stories about at the height of Iraq and Afghanistan, the military coming under fire for accepting people who fell below the threshold for mental disability being accepted.
Okay.
Do they have the ability to consent to being sent into this situation when they don't meet this criteria, but because they were desperate for people? So there you go. That's the organization misrepresenting itself, conforming to the situation that it's in, and the membership of it and who is having ownership and who's having belonging changing over the course of time, depending on the situation.
I wonder if that was emasculating. Having too much fun here.
Yeah. So I guess the last question we'll sort of tie it up with is, how do belonging and identity interact, and what does that say about our agency?
Well, I'm going to go to a Finnish cartoon for that one. There's Tove Jansson, was a marvelous cartoonist, recognized around the planet, and there have been centennial gatherings of her work. But one of the storylines she went with was she asked a question that she explored in many iterative comics, but the question was this, or the statement was this: it's rather difficult when one has many friends to show a loyalty to all of them at the same time. So you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
That the more things one belongs to, one belongs to a friend if one is committed to a relationship that's active with that friend. Facebook has changed that whole terminology.
Yeah.
You can't have 400 friends. Sorry, it's just
right.
Even Vonnegut would say that. But if friendship implies an active interest being taken on a regular basis, and what the word regular means is up to the people who are in the friendship. You probably wouldn't be able to put all of your friends in the same room and have a really comfortable experience.
Yeah.
And would you be able to put all of your organizations reduced to an individual in the same room, the organizations that you find yourself committed to at that moment, and say, yep, they're all on the same path, they're all on the same page? Probably not.
And there's just really fascinating implications of that, right? Because you talked about Vonnegut talking earlier about how you should have these experiences with as many different types of people as you can.
Yeah.
But, it comes down to what those relationships are, right? And I think that you can see how those relationships play out, determining what that scenario would be like. Because you can see a scenario where somebody has a lot of friends and they get them all together and it's very uncomfortable. But you could also see a situation where somebody who has a bunch of interactions with a bunch of people could get together and it would just be fascinating, right? There'd be a lot of value added.
Fascinating doesn't mean smooth and simple.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely. I think that, we talked about absoluteness. Yeah, it would, I think it would indicate the viability of the dynamic nature of each of those relationships.
Yeah. So what's tied up in this? In both of those people could belong to these groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what the identity and the agency of the individual is says how that experience is going to go, right? So some people, how people conform to the groups they belong to when they're out of sight of other groups, how they express their own beliefs, their own opinions, the ownership they take for those sorts of things. All those different things sort of play into what that experience would be like, right?
Yes.
And there's a psychological school that talks about people acting like actors on a stage, right? You don't always act the same in front of everybody. And I don't pretend that I do. There's definitely, if you got together everybody that I know into one room, in many ways, it would be uncomfortable with some groups or the other. But I think by and large, it would be more fascinating than uncomfortable, right? I think that there would be very few individuals that would be like, well, you're not even the person that I knew in this other setting, right? I think that most people, understand.
Would see a commonality,
right? There would be a sense of identity and a sense of agency that would cross those boundaries, in the groups that I belong to, or the attributional characteristics that I own. So, But yeah, it's something to think about.
It is.
All right. Until next time, keep pondering.